A burning chandelier crashed onto a banquet table, spraying gilded splinters across the marble floor. The taste of fine wine still clung to his tongue, but it had turned to acid the moment the convulsions began. Jin Wuying's vision fractured, a kaleidoscope of moonlit silk robes and silver hairpins, his sworn brother's silhouette backlit by leaping flames. Those familiar eyes held no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of a hunter watching prey trip a snare. The poison was already in his lungs, viscous and silent, each breath a shard of glass tearing deeper. His last living sensation was the sensation of falling, not from crumbling stone or burning beam, but from the precipice of trust itself, tumbling backward into a jagged darkness that smelled of wet earth and old, mineral rot. Silence. An infinity of it, stretched thin as a spider's thread. Then, a sound, sharp and distinct. A clatter. Like dry sticks knocked together. Jin Wuying perceived the world again, but not as flesh. There was no heartbeat drumming against his ribs, no warmth spreading through his limbs. Instead, a diffuse, ghostly awareness pulsed faintly behind what should have been his eyes, but there were no eyes, only hollow sockets rimmed with hairline fractures. His consciousness flickered, a trapped moth beating against glass, as he struggled to understand what he had become. Panic arrived in a surge that had no body to enact it. He tried to scream and heard only the dry rattle of phalanges scraping stone. He was a skeleton. The realization crystallized as he clumsily lifted a hand, no, a collection of pale metacarpals loosely bound by some dark, viscous force that mimicked tendons. The digits quivered, unfamiliar and brittle. Around him, a soupy mist coiled through a landscape of bone. The bone-grave valley, he knew, though his memory of the name arrived detached from emotion, a cold fact floating in the void of his skull. Massive ribs of some long-dead titan arched skyward like broken cathedral arches, smaller fragments crunched under his naked vertebrae as he tried to rise. The angle of every strike, the exact distribution of force to rupture organs, the rhythm of battle breathing, it was his now, as natural as his own name. Alongside it, the residual instincts of a man who had fought and lost, still sharp with the tang of desperation, coiled into his skeletal frame. The cost came immediately. A drain, a hollowing sensation in the center of his skull where a faint, pale green flame now guttered. The absorption burned his meager soul stuff, leaving him momentarily faint, the world swimming in shades of gray. If he took too much too fast, the flame might snuff out entirely. But the hound was airborne, claws extended for his fragile cervical vertebrae. Jin Wuying's borrowed battle instincts fired. His body, such as it was, responded with a fluidity that defied the lack of muscle. The Wolf Fang Palm's signature strike, Fang pierces the gullet, was originally designed to drive stiffened fingers into a soft throat. With only bone, the principle held. His phalanges grouped together into a rigid blade, aiming not for the hound's throat but for the pressure point nestled beneath its extended foreleg. The dead martial artist had fought beasts in his youth, that knowledge now belonged to the skeleton. Bone met fur and flesh with a crunch that was more feel than sound. The pressure point struck precisely, the carrion hound's leg spasmed mid-air, its entire right side locking rigid. It crashed to the ground in a tangle, yelping in shock. Jin Wuying did not relent. The Wolf Fang Palm's follow-through was a series of rapid chops, each targeting a joint, a nerve cluster, a vital point. For a long moment, Jin Wuying stood motionless, the skull flame flickering erratically. He had killed. With a dead man's art. The impossibility of it warred with a dark, vicious thrill that was entirely his own. He was helpless no longer. He looked down at the hound's corpse. The cheek stirred again, a hunger that was kin to the beast's own. Without hesitation, he knelt, his bony hands wrapping around the still-warm foreleg. The assimilation activated as soon as contact was made. The hound's bones dissolved into streams of shadow that flowed up his phalanges, absorbed not as another martial art, for beasts had no cultivated styles, but as raw physical essence. Beastly agility, a predator's survival cunning, and a sliver of feral strength infused his frame. The process was less violent than the first absorption, but the drain still hit, dimming the skull fire until it was barely an ember. For several heartbeats, though he had no heart, he teetered on the edge of oblivion. Then stability. The skeletal bones creaked, realigning microscopically. The joints tightened. His metacarpals, previously bone-white, took on a faint, ivory-hard sheen. He flexed his phalanges and felt a new responsiveness, a subtle quickening. He was still fragile, but no longer quite so brittle. Jin Wuying straightened, surveying the bone-littered expanse. The mist parted slightly, revealing the true scale of the valley, an endless graveyard of titans and men, slopes of shattered femurs and shattered skulls. This was a forge, he realized. A repository of countless martial arts, each skeleton a tome waiting to be devoured. The path to reclaiming power, to exacting vengeance on his traitorous sworn brother and the Murim Alliance that had surely been poisoned against him, lay scattered at his feet. But the cost, the constant threat of extinguishment, would be a razor's edge to walk. A new scent intruded. Not rot or wet stone, but something living. A faint, bitter herbal aroma, like crushed chrysanthemum and medicinal root, threading through the ever-present decay. He turned his skull, and the motion was smoother now, imbued with the hound's stealthy grace. There, at the edge of a bone mound that might once have been the collapsed sternum of an ancient behemoth, a figure stood frozen. A young woman in simple, earthy robes, a woven basket of herbs dropping from her grasp. Her eyes, wide and dark, reflected the pale green glow of his skull fire. A torn talisman crudely inked with cinnabar was clenched in her trembling fingers. He recognized the robes, a herbalist's garb, lowly but distinct. A disciple of a minor medicine sect, likely gathering rare death-nurtured ingredients. And she saw him, a walking skeleton, slick with the residue of a freshly consumed beast, the green flame behind his orbits flaring with an unmistakable sentience. She screamed. Not a whimper, but a full-bodied shriek of primal terror that shattered the valley's oppressive silence. Before he could react, she hurled the talisman. It spun through the damp air and slapped onto the side of his skull. The paper ignited with a blinding flash of yellow-white light, searing with the purified yang energy of a basic exo. The talisman's smoldering paper still fluttered against Jin Wuying's exposed frontal bone, white smoke curling from the blackened scorch mark it had left behind. Pain radiated not as fleshly agony but as a deep brittleness, a hollow ache that warned his skullfire might gutter if yang energy touched him again. Yet his bony hand moved before conscious thought, wolf fang palm instincts flooding his marrow with predator clarity. He seized Yaren's wrist, twisted it at precisely the angle that numbed her grip, and clamped the other hand tight over her mouth. She screamed against his phalanges, the sound muffled into a wet, terrified gurgle. Her eyes, wide and glossy with tears, reflected the ghastly vision of an animate skeleton looming over her, jaw hanging askew. Her free hand scrabbled at his radius bone, nails scraping like uneaten calcium. But his frame, already denser from the carrion hound's devoured bones, held fast. The wolf fang palm's pressure point knowledge whispered where to press to keep her from thrashing. He adjusted his grip, careful not to shatter her fragile human bones. Silence. She stumbled back a step, clutching the front of her stained linen robe as if to steady her heart. The valley's perpetual twilight, a gray haze sifting between jagged rock spires, painted her cheeks in pale silver. Her lips moved soundlessly before she found words. You speak. The legends say bone ghosts only howl. She swallowed hard. You wear no burial cloth, no talisman control. How can this be? Jin Wuying straightened his spine, vertebrae clicking like old bamboo. The carrion hound's bones had reinforced him slightly, a latticework of denser minerals webbing across his ribcage. In the dim light, his skull fire cast faint blue shadows on her face. I was Jin Wuying, Supreme Grandmaster of the Murim Alliance. My sworn brother poisoned me and threw my corpse into this cursed valley. I awoke, like this. I recall every betrayal. Every face. The words scraped out with cold, deliberate venom. Yaren's eyes widened further. The Alliance Leader? But you vanished months ago. They said you died honorably in meditation. Lies. His jawbone clacked. And now I crawl through bones, scavenging for scraps of martial memories. You see my state. Tell me, herbalist, why should I let you live when you might run to the sects and cry demon? She flinched, but something in her posture steadied. Perhaps it was the way his voice carried old etiquette, or perhaps her own outcast's instinct recognized a kindred spirit. Because I am already dead to the sects, she whispered. The Medicine Valley of Clear Dew was burned to ash by orthodox purists who called our herbal cultivation heretical. I alone escaped. I survive here because the Bone Grave Valley repels normal hunters, and the beasts avoid yang-deficient herbs. She lifted a pouch at her belt, its fabric stained dark green. I have nothing and no one. If you kill me, you gain silence. If you spare me, maybe I gain a purpose. Jin Wuying regarded her. The skull fire flickered, as if considering. He needed allies, however fragile. The alliance would come eventually, and a skeleton needed eyes and hands it could trust. But trust required proof. A rib bone lay nearby, half buried in gray soil, a remnant of some lesser martial artist consumed by valley beasts. He had touched it moments before, during the brief skirmish, and the assimilation had ignited without warning. Now the phantom bone fist's first form bloomed fresh in his memory, a technique said to be extinct for 3 generations. He stepped toward a boulder the size of a crouching tiger, its surface roughened by wind and acid rain. "Watch," he said. He raised his right arm. Phalanges curled into a specific claw, thumb pressing against the middle joint of the index finger, while the other 3 digits bent at contradicting angles that looked painful even on living hands. The absorbed muscle memory guided every joint. As he thrust forward, his entire arm blurred, his shoulder socket popped and rotated a full 360 degrees, wrist executing a snake-like double lash. Fingertips struck the boulder not with flesh-covered impact, but with a penetrating shockwave that bored a fist-sized hole clean through the stone. Cracks spiderwebbed outward, and a moment later the entire rock split in 2 halves, collapsing with a ground-shaking thud. Dust bloomed. Yeren coughed, then stared at the shattered boulder, then at the skeleton's undamaged hand. That was no wolf fang technique. That was phantom bone fist. The ghost wrist piercer. Her voice trembled with reverence and fear. It's been lost since the Iron Bones sect fell 60 years ago. How? The bone I touched belonged to a disciple of that sect. His art is now mine. Jin Wuying flexed his fingers, watching microscopic fractures seal as residual chi from the assimilation repaired the stress. I need more such bones. Stronger ones. If you truly wish to serve, guide me to places where fallen masters lie. Yeren pressed her lips together, then reached into her pouch and withdrew a cluster of roots, their translucent skins glowing faintly amber. These are joint lubricating herbs. Your movements are quick, but your joints still grind dry, any real battle will crack you apart. If you take me as a disciple, even a temporary one, I can supply these. And I know a place, the grave of the 6-armed monk. It's 3 li east, past the Razor Spine Gorge. They say the monk mastered a joint-breaking art that required no internal chi, only leverage and angle. His remains were buried there alongside his disciples after a demon beast attack. But the path is dangerous, and I've never dared go alone. A monk who broke joints without chi, Jin Wuying's skullfire brightened. The Heaven's 6-wrist dance. I have heard of it. The technique belonged to a forgotten lineage, exactly the type he needed to counter the fluid sword arts of orthodox sections. What do you want in return? Yeren met his gaze squarely. Protection. And knowledge. I may never cultivate chi, but I want to learn martial theory. The Clear Dew sect was humble, but our herb lore was incomplete without understanding the body's meridian paths. You were the greatest grandmaster. Teach me what you can, and I will be your eyes, your supply line, and your silence. A strange sensation stirred in Jin Wuying's chest cavity, something like the ghost of an old heartbeat. He had led thousands, yet none had followed him into death. This girl, barely out of her teenage years, offered loyalty not out of fear but out of shared loss. So be it, he said. Your herbs first, apply them now. We moved before the bone-eater beast sent my aura. She approached hesitantly, then knelt before the towering skeleton. From her pouch she took a small mortar and pestle, crushed the amber roots into a fragrant paste, and began dabbing it into his knee joints, elbow hinges, and the delicate vertebrae of his neck. The effect was immediate, the rough scrape of bone on bone softened into a smooth, oiled glide. A cool numbness spread through his frame, dampening the constant ache of arid desiccation. He exhaled a plume of gray dust, a mimic of breath. Better, he rasped. Lead. They trekked through the valley's perpetual gloom. Ancient bones crunched underfoot, femurs, shattered skulls, the occasional giant rib from some beast beyond his knowledge. Yeren moved with the quiet wariness of a prey animal, pointing out sinkholes where fungal blooms digested carcasses and the territorial markers of slumbering beast packs. Jin Wuying noted everything, his tactical mind overlaying battle maps onto the terrain. If the Alliance ever descended here, he would need every hidden trench and ambush point. How do you understand that technique so quickly? Yeren asked as they skirted a cliff of fused bone gravel. Even if the rib remembered the form, muscle memory requires flesh and sinew. My assimilation grants me not only the physical patterns, but the original cultivator's chi memories, their decades of practice condensed into an instant. Ev. The centipede's 1,000 legs slashed through the air like a curtain of rusted scythes, each jointed limb crackling with the brittle echo of ancient bone. Jin Wuying's skullfire flared, the cold blue flame casting dancing shadows across the valley's bleached canyon walls. He had no lungs to draw breath, but something deeper, an echo of instinct, screamed at him. His skeletal frame, still fragile as sun-bleached twigs, would shatter under a single direct blow. Before the first leg could descend, he twisted, seizing Yeren by the collar of her tattered robe. His bony fingers nearly closed too hard, old martial habits not yet calibrated to undead strength. He flung her sideways. She tumbled between two narrow slabs of stone, a crevice just wide enough to shield her small form. Her cry of protest was swallowed by the grinding roar of the centipede's approach. "Stay!" Jin's jaw clacked, the sound sharp as a whip crack. No throat, no vocal cords, yet his will shaped the air into a command. Yeren pressed herself deeper into the stone womb, her wide eyes glinting with terror and something else, faith. The bone-eater centipede lunged. Its body, a segmented horror the length of 10 horses, was a walking graveyard. Between the chitinous plates, human skeletons jutted like grotesque armor, ribcages knotted together, skulls leering from hip joints, femurs fused into serrated mandibles. Every warrior whose remains were embedded here had died in a different battle stance. Jin could feel it, the faint, dissonant hum of dozens of martial chi signatures, trapped in silent conflict. He threw himself sideways, phantom bone fist already igniting along his right arm. Spectral light limned the bones as he struck out, the first form, grave crossing palm, detonating against the centipede's flank. The impact shattered a few leg segments, bone shards spinning into the gloom. But the beast merely screeched and whipped its tail. 100 legs adjusted, compensating. The remaining limbs realigned, and now the creature moved differently, a heavy, rooted stance John that reminded Jin of the earthbound ox style. The fused bones were not just armor, they were a library of stolen techniques, and the centipede could channel them instinctively. Jin ducked under a sweeping leg, but another caught him in the ribs. The crack of his own bone was sickening, a sound that vibrated through his entire frame. He staggered, death energy flickering. A healthy skeleton might have crumbled, but his marrow, the seat of necro-ki, held him together. Barely. Analyzing. Always analyzing. Even in undeath, the Supreme Grandmaster's mind worked. Each segment of the centipede housed a distinct stance, a master's last will frozen in bone. If he could touch them, he could steal them. And in stealing, he might find the key. A human arm bone, still articulated with tendons of dried sinew, jutted from a segment just behind the thing's head. The centipede reared to crush him under its thorax. Jin darted forward instead of retreating, a mad gamble. He thrust his left hand up and pressed his skeletal fingers against that protruding arm. Necro-ki osseous assimilation ignited. A stream of marrow-cold knowledge flooded into him. A name, Iron Bridge Stance. A middle-aged martial master's final memory, defending a mountain pass, legs rooted, chi sinking into the earth until the body became unyielding as forged steel. Instantly, Jin's own bone structure shifted. Calcium plates realigned along his spine, his femurs thickened, his stance widening. A dull gray sheen coated his skeleton. When the centipede's descending body crashed down, the impact rang like a struck gong, but Jin did not break. He held. But the cost was steep. His skullfire guttered, the blue flame shrinking to a wavering spark. Death energy drained through him like water through a sieve. Too many assimilations in rapid succession and he would extinguish entirely. He couldn't afford to defend forever. He needed to attack, to dismantle this living armory. The centipede's legs, each one a potential weapon. Jin released the iron bridge stance and sprang back, barely avoiding a flurry of kicks from 3 different legs, each one carrying a distinct martial flavor. A left leg snapped out in a high arc, the motion flowing like a river, whirlwind footwork. No, the right leg was driving forward with brutal linear force, hurricane kick. He could feel them, latent and waiting. So he began a deadly dance. Instead of evading, he deliberately let a leg graze his shoulder while his hand clamped onto the tibia of another. Assimilate. Hurricane kick, a devastating front kick that borrowed the momentum of a falling star. The technique seared into his marrow, and he could suddenly read the leg's trajectory before it even twitched. His own right leg, bare bone, mimicked the motion unconsciously, splintering a nearby leg segment. But again, his skullfire dimmed further. Now it was no larger than a candle flame. Yeren's voice, thin and desperate, echoed from the crevice, the herbs. Take them. A small bundle of glossy leaves landed near his foot, joint lubricating balm, but she had also thrown a handful of dried replenishing petals. They wouldn't restore his death energy, but they might stabilize his consciousness. He didn't hesitate. His foot ground the petals into bone dust and a faint, soothing coolness seeped into his skull. Enough for one more series of assimilations. The centipede, enraged, coiled like a spring. Jean saw his opening. Two leg segments, side by side, held the remnants of warriors who had been bitter enemies in life, one rigid and rooted, the other fluid and evasive. He had already absorbed their essences, the rooted stance from a leg that had nearly pinned him, the evasive footwork from a leg he'd touched seconds ago. They were contradictory. Oil and water. But the centipede's fused body was now trying to use both simultaneously as it prepared a pincer strike. Jean slammed his bony palm against the ground, channeling the last of his death energy to mimic the rooted stance. At the same moment, he hurled a loose skull, a mangled thing from the centipede's armor, directly at the joint connecting the two contradictory segments. The skull struck a neural cluster of fused martial chi. The effect was instantaneous. The centipede's body tried to execute an immovable block and a whirling evasion at the same time. Chi pathways, never meant to coexist, collided within the chitin. The conflicting martial memories ignited. A chain reaction of micro-explosions rippled through the segments, iron-hard leg joints vaporized, warrior bones launched like shrapnel. The centipede screamed, a wet, shattering sound, as its own carapace tore apart from within. Internal residue conflicted, combusted, and the entire rear half of the beast detonated in a cloud of bone meal and black ichor. The centipede collapsed, twitching. Its head segments still snapped blindly, but the main threat was dead. Jean stood swaying, his skullfire a mere ember, barely a flicker. He absorbed nothing more, even one touch would snuff him out. His skeletal body creaked as he limped toward the carcass. The iron bridge stance's aftereffect left his joints feeling rusted, but the hurricane kick and whirlwind footwork already settled into his marrow, joining phantom bone fist. He would need time to integrate them fully. Yeren scrambled from the crevice, her face pale but determined. She rushed to him, already tearing a leaf to press against his cracked ribs. You suicidal bonehead. You almost extinguished yourself. Her hands, though trembling, were steady as she applied the bomb. Jean let her work, his eye sockets scanning the wreckage. Among the fused bones, something glinted, half buried under a shattered femur. He knelt, the movement so humanly weary that Yeren paused. With careful fingers, he extracted a medallion. It was bronze, half decayed, but the insignia was unmistakable, a flying crane inside a crescent moon. The emblem of the Murim Alliance. His alliance. The alliance he once led. He turned it over. On the back, embedded in a corroded metal, was a tracking talisman, the kind used for high-value prisoners. The necrotic chi that had sustained the centipede must have fed it, because now the talisman pulsed with a faint, malignant red light. It was activating. Sending a signal. Jean Wuying's memory supplied the rest. The moment a talisman like this activated, a sensor flag in the Alliance's central watchtower would raise an alarm. A cold certainty filled him. Faster than he could crush it, the damage was done. The medallion had identified something, the undead residue of its original owner, combined with his own bone signature, a former Grandmaster's imprint now twisted by death. Far to the east, in the stone halls of the Murim Alliance headquarters, a bronze flag upon a marble board suddenly flared. A watchman named Jinho, a junior disciple with drooping shoulders, jolted awake. The bone-gray valley stretched endlessly in a shroud of perpetual twilight. After the battle with the centipede, Jean Wuying had not rested, his skullfire still sputtered with a weak, guttering light, and his death energy reserves were so low that even the faintest movement sent a tremor of exhaustion through his brittle frame. Yet he could not afford to stop. The tracking talisman had sent its signal, and somewhere beyond the valley, the Murim Alliance was stirring. So he pushed deeper, guided by a resonance that pulled at the very marrow of his undead existence, a call from an ancient, powerful source of martial bone. Yeren walked behind him, her footsteps soft on the carpet of crushed bone fragments. The young herbalist clutched a pouch of stabilizing herbs and kept her eyes darting toward every shadow. She had seen enough to know that her skeletal companion was no mindless monster, but the valley's oppressive silence still weighed on her. Master Jean, she whispered, using the title she had hesitantly adopted, where are we going? You've been moving like you can hear something I can't. A skeleton, Jean Wuying replied without turning his skull. His jaw clicked with each word, the sound dry and hollow. A very old one, holding power that has not been touched in centuries. It's embedded in a cliff face ahead. I can feel its chi memory like a distant bell, 6 distinct echoes, layered together. Yeren frowned. 6 echoes? What does that mean? It means the monk had 6 arms. The cliff rose before them like a broken wall of time. Vines and black moss clung to its surface, but amidst the vegetation, a shape began to resolve, a giant, humanoid skeleton fused into the rock itself. The bones were thicker than any humans, glowing faintly with a phosphorescent green light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of some long-forgotten breath. And indeed, the skeleton had 6 arms, 2 in the normal position, 2 extending from the shoulder blades, and 2 smaller ones sprouting from the ribs, each hand frozen in a different mudra, as if the monk had been meditating at the moment of his fossilization. Jin Wuying stood before it, his empty eye sockets locking onto the ancient remains. The skull of the fossilized monk was half-turned, its expression caught in a strange serenity. Even in death, the being radiated an aura of profound martial mastery. This was no beast, it was a cultivator who had walked a path that merged the physical with the transcendent. "I need to touch it," Jin said, his voice barely a whisper. Yeren took a step back, her face pale. "The last time you grabbed a monster's bone, you almost shattered. That thing is 10 times stronger. Are you sure?" "I don't have a choice." He raised one skeletal hand and placed it flat against the fossilized sternum. "If I can't grow stronger now, the Alliance will crush me before I even reach my brother's doorstep." The moment his phalanges made contact, the world dissolved. Necro-Ki osseous assimilation tore into him with the force of an avalanche. 6 distinct streams of martial knowledge slammed into his consciousness simultaneously, each one a fully perfected joint-locking technique designed for a body with more limbs than Jin currently possessed. The first technique focused on wrist captures, the second on elbow dislocations, the third on shoulder rotations so violent they could tear a limb from its socket. The fourth and fifth were leg-locking maneuvers meant to immobilize and break, and the sixth was a full-body articulation art that tied all the others together, allowing a practitioner to unhinge every joint at will and fight in ways that defied anatomy. Jin Wuying's mind screamed as the flood overwhelmed him. He saw flashes of battles, the 6-armed monk, living in an age of demons and dark chi, twisting, bending, striking from impossible angles. The monk's battle instincts burned into him, but they were designed for a body that had 3 times the limbs. Jin's current skeleton could barely process the information. His ribcage creaked, hairline fractures spreading across his humerus and femur. His skull fire flickered dangerously, shrinking to a tiny ember. Yeren cried out, "Master!" She started forward but a pulse of dark energy repelled her. The pale green light of the fossil intensified, wrapping Jin in a cocoon of luminescent chi. His entire bone structure vibrated on the verge of disintegration. Inside the storm, Jin realized he could not hold all 6 techniques as they were. His death energy was insufficient, and his core skeletal integrity would crack beyond repair if he didn't mediate the influx. With desperate resolve, he began to sacrifice other memories. The iron bridge stance, which he had just absorbed from the centipede's arm bone, he pushed it into the maelstrom, letting its chi memory burn away as fuel. The hurricane kick and whirlwind footwork followed, their forms unraveling to provide the necessary energy to stabilize the assimilation. Even fragments of his own original foundation techniques, remnants from his past life as Grandmaster, were offered up to calm the raging sea of new knowledge. The sacrifice worked. The 6 streams slowly merged, condensing into a single, unified art. Jin Wuying felt his consciousness being restructured as well. The techniques adapted to his skeletal frame, modifying themselves. Instead of 6 physical arms, the art would teach him how to dislocate and rearticulate his own limbs at any joint, wrists, elbows, shoulders, even the spine, creating the illusion of extra limbs by extending his reach and striking from directions that should be impossible. The Heaven's 6-wrist dance. When the light faded, Jin Wuying was still standing, but his frame had changed. The fractures were still there, but his bones had absorbed a new density. His skull fire, though still faint, now burned with a deeper, more stable hue, a trace of that ancient green luminescence. He withdrew his hand from the fossil and took a stumbling step back. "Master!" Yeren rushed forward, catching his arm before he fell. Her touch was warm against his cold bone, and she flinched only slightly. "You did it. You're still alive." In a manner of speaking, Jin rasped. He looked at his own right arm. With a thought, he triggered the Heaven's 6-wrist dance. His wrist joint popped out of its socket with a soft click, and then his forearm extended, not breaking but simply sliding farther than it should. The bones remained connected by a thin, dark mist of death chi that acted as an artificial tendon. He rotated his wrist 270 degrees, then snapped it back into place. Yeren gasped, her eyes wide. Jin flexed both arms. He could dislocate his elbows and shoulders now, extending his reach by nearly 2 feet beyond his normal span, then twist to strike at angles a normal skeleton could never achieve. It was a bizarre and terrifying sight, a skeleton whose limbs moved like serpents, coiling and uncoiling. With this, Jean murmured, more to himself than to her, I can fight multiple enemies as if I had 6 arms. No orthodox martial artist will be able to read my movements. Yeren shook her head in awe but then pointed a trembling finger at the cliff face. Look, there's a crack behind the skeleton. A hidden chamber. Indeed, as the fossil's glow dimmed, a seam in the rock became visible. Jin Wuying used his newly limber arms to reach into the gap and push aside the stone slab. It ground open, revealing a small meditation cell carved into the cliff. Inside, the air was dry and still, untouched for centuries. A single stone pedestal held a rolled-up scroll bound by silk threads that had not decayed, protected by a warding chi that still hummed faintly. Jean entered, his footsteps echoing. He unrolled the scroll carefully. The text was in an ancient script, but the 6-armed monk's chi memories allowed him to read it. The title was simple, Bone Marrow Chi Sutra. As Jean read, his skull fire brightened with understanding. The scripture detailed a cultivation method specifically designed for undead entities, skeletons, revenants, and other beings who possessed no living blood or flesh. It taught that while the living cultivated blood chi by circulating it through meridians, the undead could cultivate death essence by condensing it within the bone marrow. Even though his marrow had long dried up, the scripture described a metaphysical process, using the tiny hollow spaces inside his bones as a repository for death energy, refining it through cyclic compression until it became a dense, liquid-like force that strengthened the skeletal structure from within. He immediately sat cross-legged on the stone floor, much to Yeren's surprise, and began to follow the sutra's breathing patterns, even though he had no lungs. The technique worked not through breath but through rhythmic pulses of his skull fire and the intentional drawing in of death aura from the valley outside. The air shrieked as 3 swords carved through the gloom, their edges sheathed in pale blue chi that left frost-like trails. Ju Suk, the sturdiest of the 3, thrust his blade forward in a low, sweeping arc aimed at Jin Wuying's legs. One pill, lanky and nervous, flanked left with a rapid flurry of stabs, each one humming with the resonance of a half-formed sword technique. Cheon Guang led from the center, his heirloom blade longer and heavier, its inscription glowing, a master's blade, heavy with the residue of its previous owner. The trio moved in sync, their formation a dance they had practiced for years, yet imperfect, their breaths too shallow, their footwork slightly mistimed. Jin Wuying's skull fire flickered behind hollow sockets. He watched the swords approach as though peering through a fogged window. Instincts that were not his own whispered from the depths of his cracked carpals, the sensations of iron bridge stance, hurricane kick, the whirlwind footwork, all sacrificed, yet their lingering ghosts guided him now. He twisted his spine, and his arms detached precisely at the shoulders, the bone heads dislocating with a wet, grinding pop. 2 additional arms, reshaped from his own ribcage and fused with death essence, sprouted from his sides, giving him 6 writhing limbs, each glistening with faint marrow light. Heaven's 6-wrist dance. The arms moved not with muscle memory but with the cold logic of joint-lock geometry. Cheon Guang's eyes widened as the skeleton's hand, a collection of articulated phalanges, caught the flat of his blade and twisted. The sword hummed, refusing to submit, but the angle was perfect. Jin Wuying's wrist dislocated backward, and his fingers clamped like a vice around the crossguard. For a heartbeat, he almost succeeded in disarming the youth. Then one pill's flurry found a gap. 3 stabs punctured the skeleton's left floating ribs, chipping bone but finding no flesh. Sparks erupted. Jin Wuying spun away, his 6 limbs retreating into his frame, clicking back into place. His skull fire dimmed momentarily, the dance cost marrow essence. The bone ghost is tiring. Ju Suk bellowed, his confidence surging. He slashed downward, a textbook blue cloud vertical sunder. Jin Wuying flowed aside, his bare toe bones scratching the cliffside gravel. He was leading them, step by step, toward the base of the cliff where the fossilized 6-armed monk had crumbled. But beyond that collapsed skeleton, half buried under fallen shale, lay a low, weathered tombstone. It bore the crest of the Blue Cloud sect and a name eroded nearly smooth, the resting place of a master who had died 3 generations ago, his sword art considered the pinnacle of the clan's heritage. Yeren huddled behind a boulder, her fingers clamped over her mouth to stifle a scream. She saw the skeleton retreat, his movements growing jerky. She had witnessed him absorb the monk's techniques, but this fight seemed different, deliberate. He was testing the swordsmen, mapping their rhythm. Suddenly, Qion Guang launched the heirloom blade's signature technique, Blue Cloud Cascade. The sword became a curtain of steel, descending like a waterfall. Jin Wuying's spine arched backward until his skull touched the ground, and then his leg swept out, the calcaneus of his foot scraping against the tombstone. Contact. A jolt like lightning, but cold and black, shot through his entire bone lattice. The necro-key osseous assimilation ignited without a command. Deep beneath the earth, entombed in a rotted coffin, the master's skeleton, still wreathed in the fading imprint of perfected blue cloud sword art, awakened to his touch. In that frozen instant, a tidal wave of martial memories flooded Jin Wuying's marrow chambers, decades of sword forms, the subtle internal chi rotations, the seasonal cycles of practice, the fatal flaw that had been passed down incorrectly through the generations. The flaw was in the third transition of the cascade, a half-inch misalignment that left the wielder's right kidney gaping open for a fraction of a second after the seventh strike. The assimilation nearly shattered him. His skull fire guttered, shrinking to a pinprick of violet light. He felt the death essence in his bone marrow boil away to fuel the absorption, and for a terrifying moment, the world faded to static. Then the new knowledge settled, knitting into his own phantom bone fist and heaven's six-wrist dance, forming a sinister hybrid. The blue cloud sword art now lived in his bones. He straightened. The motion was unnaturally fluid, no longer the creak of a brittle undead. His arms extended, and his fingers, previously unadorned, now moved with the exact cadence of the celestial whisper stance, the opening posture of the true, unbroken art. The three young masters faltered, their formation wobbling as they instinctively recognized the posture they had only seen in their elders. "You," Qion Guang stammered. "That's impossible." Jin Wuying's jaw opened, and a sound like grinding stones emerged, his voice, hollow yet dripping with mockery. 3 generations you have practiced, and still you plant your left foot too wide on the 7th cut. Your ancestor weeps. He moved. Not with a sword, but with his right arm, the finger bones fused into a blade-like edge. He mimicked the blue cloud cascade, but inverted, each motion a counter. His first strike tapped the flat of Ju Suk's blade at the exact weak angle, sending it flying into the cliff. The second strike slipped past one pill's guard, the bony knuckles wrapping the boy's sword wrist, forcing a howl and a clatter. Then he turned to Qion Guang, whose heirloom blade glowed defiantly. The skeleton stepped into the cascade's own rhythm, meeting the 7th strike head-on, but instead of blocking, he sidestepped by precisely the half-inch the original form required, and his finger blade shot forward, stopping a hair's breadth from Qion Guang's right kidney. Time paused. The young master's face drained of color. He dropped his sword reflexively, and the blade chimed on stone. Your clan's greatest treasure rots in your unworthy hands, Jin Wuying rasped. He scooped up the heirloom sword, and before the horrified gazes of the three, his other hand snapped it in two across his knee bone. The metal shrieked, and from the broken halves, a visible wisp of metallic essence, once tempered in a master's chi, rose like smoke. Jin Wuying inhaled it through his nasal cavity, and the substance coursed down his arm bones. His phalanges darkened, then gleamed, a permanent coat of steel blue alloy fusing to the bone. When he flexed his fingers, they rang like blades being drawn. The other 2 swords skittered away, but he spared them only a glance. Take your crippled pride back to your sect. Tell them the bone demon inherits what they abandon. And tell them, he paused, the violet light in his eyes flaring, that I remember everything. The youths scrambled, dragging Qion Guang with them, their sobs echoing off the stone. Jin Wuying stood motionless until the last footstep faded. Then his posture collapsed. His knee joints seized with an audible crack, and his skull fire shrank until it was no larger than a candle flame. The metallic finger blades felt heavy, dragging his arms. Every marrow channel throbbed with raw, empty pain, the cost of assimilating a master's life's work in a heartbeat and channeling it through an untempered vessel. Yeren rushed out, her satchel of herbs bouncing against her side. Master Jin. Your light, it's almost gone. She fumbled for a dried moonbloom root, a plant that stored residual life essence. She pressed it against his sternum, but the flower blackened and crumbled instantly, insufficient. You need to rest, to meditate on the bone marrow chi sutra, now. He managed a slight nod, the vertebrae of his neck groaning. Help me sit against the tombstone. She guided him down, his back now resting against the very grave he had plundered. The irony was not lost on him. He began cycling the bone marrow chi sutra, drawing the faint death essence from the valley floor to replenish what he had spent. Slowly, the skull fire steadied, but it was a candle in a windstorm. A long silence hung over the valley, broken only by the whisper of distant bone-eating beasts. Yeren watched over him, her brown eyes wet with worry. She had seen enough to know that this day he had crossed a line, he was no longer a scavenging ghoul. He had become a collector of stolen inheritances. Then, from far beyond the valley's rim, a rumble. Not thunder. It was subterranean, rhythmic, like the approach of something immense and alive. Jin Wuying's skull lifted, his sensors prickling. The vibration carried a familiar resonance, the disciplined march of a martial elder, someone whose chi signature was twined with memories of the Alliance's training grounds. Yeren tensed. What is that? An old debt, Jin Wuying murmured, his voice bare. The valley air grew heavy, thick with the scent of crushed bone dust and the ozone tang of lingering chi. Jin Wuying's skull fire flickered, a guttering candle in the sockets of his bleached skull, as the distant rumble resolved into measured, deliberate footsteps. Stones crunched under the weight of a man who had long ago come to terms with the burdens he bore. Elder Yun Sangho emerged from the mist-choked ravine, his grey robe billowing like a ghost shroud. His face, weathered by decades of thankless duty, was a map of sorrow and resolve. In his right hand, he clutched a palm-sized jade tablet, its surface swirling with imprisoned light. He stopped 10 paces from the bone-strewn clearing where Jin Wuying sat propped against a boulder. Yeren, kneeling beside the skeleton, looked up with wide, fearful eyes, her fingers, stained green from the crushed revitalizing herbs she had been applying, trembled. So the rumors are true, Yun Sangho said, his voice hoarse, as if he had been holding his tongue for miles. A bone ghost that moves like a man, a creature that shatters the swords of Blue Cloud Sect's finest. I had to see it myself. He took another step forward, and the jade in his grip began to hum. You were the movements of our fallen Alliance leader. Why? Are you his vengeful spirit, or some demon that desecrated his grave? Jin Wuying did not rise. The metallic sheen on his fingerbones glinted dully as he flexed them. The drain from the earlier assimilation still scraped at his marrow, leaving his joints stiff, every motion a conscious act of will. Yun Sangho, he rasped, the sound like dry twigs snapping. You were always too thorough for your own good. Did you come alone, old friend? The title old friend hit the elder like a physical blow. His jaw tightened. Don't speak as if you know me. I served Jin Wuying for 20 years. I held his cloak, sharpened his blade, carried his orders to the farthest outposts. You are not him. Am I not? Jin Wuying tilted his skull, and for a moment, the skull fire steadied, burning a deep, melancholic blue. Then look. Use that jade you carry, the memory-scribing jade, isn't it? I recognized its resonance from the first tremor. Show me what you think I've forgotten. Yun Sangho's eyes widened. He had not expected the creature to name the artifact. With a slow, reverent motion, he raised the tablet and channeled a thread of chi into its core. The jade blazed white, and a panorama of light unfurled between them, an illusion woven from the elder's own memories. The scene was the grand pavilion of the Murim Alliance, bathed in golden morning. Jin Wuying, alive and radiant in his prime, stood on the ceremonial platform, his black gold robe embroidered with the azure dragon. He was clasping the hand of a young soldier, his expression warm, paternal. No one is expendable, the memory Jin Wuying said, the sound echoing across the valley. We protect the weak not because it's easy, but because it is the root of all martial honor. Another flash, Jin Wuying dueling a dark sect master on a rain-lashed cliff, shielding a village behind him, his sword a blinding crescent of justice. Another, Jin Wuying weeping over the body of a fallen disciple, whispering oaths of vengeance against the demonic path. Each image struck Jin Wuying's exposed soul like a hammer blow. The skeleton's frame trembled, and a low, creaking sound, nearly a groan, escaped his lipless mouth. Yeren reached out, her hand hovering over his bony shoulder, unsure if touching him would cause more pain. Master, she whispered. Do you see? Yun Sangho's voice cracked. This is Jin Wuying. The greatest grandmaster the Murim has ever known. A man of unbreakable principle. If you are truly him, then feel this remorse. Stop this desecration of bones, this unholy mimicry of his arts. Repent, and perhaps your soul can find peace. The skeleton's fingers dug into the soil, skittering across loose pebbles until they brushed against something. A fragment of bone. Not the dense, cheerish skeleton of a master martial artist, but the remains of a common man, a skeleton half buried beneath a tangle of dead roots, its ribs shattered long ago, a rusted alliance insignia still pinned to the shreds of a tattered uniform. Jin Wuying's consciousness, already raw, was flooded by the necro-ki osseous assimilation before he could even brace himself. The dead man's identity crashed into him like a wave of lie. Trooper Mok Sun-young, a low-ranking Alliance patrolman who, 23 years ago, had stumbled upon evidence of illegal tribute collections by his own commander. He had reported it through proper channels, trusting the Alliance's justice. In return, he was framed for theft of martial scrolls, publicly denounced, and executed in secret. His bones were dumped here, in the Bone Grave Valley, unmourned and unavenged. With the memories came the technique, a desperate, improvised art forged in a brutal prison cell, taught by a fellow inmate who had once been a monk of the Forgotten Path. Its name seared itself into Jin Wuying's mind, soul-releasing palm. A strike that bypassed flesh to directly attack the spirit, a technique born of righteous fury against corrupt authorities. It had never been perfected in life, but now, filtered through the lens of necro-ki, its flaws dissolved. Jin Wuying absorbed not just the palm's form, but the martyr's burning indignation, his final dying curse against the very alliance that had murdered him. The skull fire erupted from blue to crimson. The heat blazed outward, and Yeren flinched back, shielding her face. Jin Wuying rose to his feet in one fluid, gravitation-defying motion, the borrowed memory of 1,000 heroic deeds now clashing with the raw, undiluted truth of the Alliance's hypocrisy. The world of light and honor that Yun Sang-ho had painted shattered like a soap bubble. You want me to repent? Jin Wuying's voice became a chorus, his own dry rasp layered over a spectral howl. He raised his right palm, and a ghostly silhouette of a massive hand, translucent and thrashing with chained fury, materialized in the air before him. Then let me show you the gratitude the Alliance gives to its faithful. He did not strike the elder. He thrust the soul-releasing palm forward, not into flesh, but into the jade tablet. The counter-memory wave, every stolen instant of Trooper Mok Sun-young's betrayal, amplified by the technique, exploded from his bony palm and collided with the false golden hues. The jade's light curtain warped into a scream of white noise. Images flickered madly, the grand pavilion overlaid with blood-stained prison walls, the applauding crowd replaced by jeering guards, Jin Wuying's smile rotting into a rictus of agony. The tablet's surface cracked, web-like fissures spreading, and with a sound like a breaking bell, it shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Yun Sang-ho stumbled backward, hands over his ears, his face a mask of horror. He stared at the fragments of jade on the ground, then at the crimson flame skeleton before him. What was that? Jin Wuying's arm fell to his side. The spectral palm dissipated, but the righteous fury still simmered in his sockets. He pointed a metallic fingerbone at the scattered shards. That was the truth. While you were polishing the Alliance leader's boots, troopers like Mok Sun-young were being fed to the Bone Grave Valley for trying to do the right thing. My brother, Kong, was the architect of those betrayals, and he used my reputation as a shield. I was not just murdered by him, I was used to sanctify an entire generation of corruption. He stepped closer, and his skull fire dimmed, the crimson retreating to a weary amber. I am Jin Wuying. I remember the rain-lashed cliff. I remember the weeping. But I also remember the poison sliding down my throat, the smile on Kang's face, and the cold dirt of this valley swallowing my body. I have no reason to seek your Alliance's forgiveness, Yun Sang-ho. I seek only to become strong enough to tear it down from within, starting with my traitorous brother. Yun Sang-ho sank to his knees. His fingers scrabbled at the dirt, picking up a fragment of jade. If what you say is true, then everything I believed, his voice broke. But I cannot simply trust the words of a skeleton. How do I know this wasn't some demon's trick? You don't. Jin Wuying's tone was flat. But you came here with a duty, didn't you? To confirm the bone ghost's identity. Report what you will. But I will offer you a bargain. He glanced at Yeren, who had crept to the edge of the clearing, her face pale but determined. Your granddaughter, Hyo-jin. She's been ill for years with a marrow-wasting fever, haven't you? Yeren, can you formulate a cure from your medicine sect knowledge? Yeren's eyes widened, and she nodded quickly. Yes. There's an ancient formula, the iron marrow draft. If I have access to... The chasm's lip crumbled beneath Jin Wuying's skeletal foot, sending pebbles spinning into the abyss. No sound returned. Yeren knelt beside him, her breath a thin mist in the fungal glow. She had braided her hair back with strips of gravecloth, and a pouch of dried blood bloom bulged at her hip. The descent will take days, master, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The old texts call this place the Gravid Mall. They say gravity forgets its duty here. Jin Wuying's skullfire flared, casting dancing shadows across the bony plates that now armored his spine. Since absorbing the martyr's soul-releasing palm, the plates had grown thicker, sharper, like the beginnings of an exoskeleton. He flexed his phalanges, feeling the death knot tendons shift beneath the bone. "I have no weight," he rasped, his voice a dry rattle. "The maw cannot betray me. But you are flesh." He raised a hand and a thin stream of marrow chi seeped from his metacarpals, solidifying into a harness of spun bone fibers. "Strap this around your waist. It will anchor you to me." Yeren obeyed without hesitation. The harness cinched tight, the cold essence seeping into her robes. She shivered but said nothing. Together they stepped off the edge. Immediately the world inverted. For a nauseating heartbeat, Yeren's stomach lurched as gravity wrenched sideways, slamming her against the chasm wall. Jin Wuying's frame absorbed the shift, his bone toes digging into the rock. The harness went taut, and he pulled her gently after him as he scuttled down the vertical face like a spider. "Don't trust the ground," he instructed, his voice echoing in her mind through a whisper of chi. "It will flip again. Watch the lichen, it grows toward the heart of the valley, not the sky." The walls rippled with pale, glowless life. Sheets of luminescent fungus pulsed in slow rhythms, casting just enough light to see the shifting seams where gravity fractured. Yeren spotted a patch of purplish vapor pooling in a crevice below them. "Master, stop." She pointed. "That's carrion breath blight. If it touches your skull fire, it'll ignite into soul-burning flame." Jin Wuying halted, his empty socket scanning the miasma. His brother had used such poisons once, laced with spiritual acid. The memory kindled a cold fury in his marrow. "Can you neutralize it?" "I can try." Yeren uncorked a small gourd and shook out a fine powder, crushed starthistle and dried widow's kiss, herbs she had gathered from the valley's upper slopes. She blew the powder into the vaporous patch. The purple mist recoiled, condensing into harmless droplets that trickled down the stone. "It will hold for a few minutes. We must move quickly." They descended further, the chasm deepening until the light of the surface was a forgotten rumor. The air grew cold, heavy with the smell of old stone and older death. Jin Wuying's connection to the ambient death essence hummed louder here, a song only his marrow could hear. Then the gravity field shifted again, this time with violent force. Yeren screamed as the wall beneath her hands dissolved into empty space, and she swung out over a vast, cathedral-like cavern. The harness held, but she dangled helplessly, the abyss yawning below. Jin Wuying anchored himself with a spike of bone driven deep into the rock. He reeled her in slowly, hand over hand, each movement precise. Just as she reached his side, the darkness came alive. A sound like tearing silk, then a chorus of hisses. From fissures in the cavern walls poured legless things, pale and blind, their bodies segmented with chitinous rings. They tasted the air with forked tongues of white flame, sensing the heat of Yeren's living blood. "Blind serpents," Yeren breathed. "They hunt by chi signature." Jin Wuying released Yeren and let her cling to a ledge. His skullfire dimmed as he suppressed his own aura, a trick he had learned in the early days of his undeath, when predators in a bone-grave valley had pursued him. The serpents hesitated, confused. Then he struck. He launched himself into their midst, phantom bone fist lending his arms a ghostly blur. His knuckles caved in the skull of the first serpent before it could snap. A second lunged at his leg, he twisted mid-air, the new spinal plates deflecting its teeth, and drove an elbow into its spine. But more poured out, a tide of blind hunger. Yeren scrambled onto a higher shelf and rummaged in her pouch. She found a bundle of dried scream leaf, a plant that, when crushed, emitted a piercing vibration through the chi spectrum, akin to a hawk's cry. She threw the bundle into the mass of serpents. It burst in a cloud of silver motes, and the creatures recoiled, their own echolocation overwhelmed. Jin Wuying seized the moment, gathering death chi into his hands. He unleashed a wave of soul-releasing palm, the force ripping through the serpents' bodies and scattering them into the void. Silence returned, broken only by Yeren's ragged breathing. Blood, pale and cold, slicked the rocks. Jin Wuying retrieved a few serpent vertebrae from the mess, touching them briefly. Faint impressions flooded his consciousness, primitive reactions, no martial arts, but the raw death essence was a welcome trickle into his depleted reserves. He discarded them. "We're close," he said, his skull rotating to face the deeper dark. "I feel it. A presence that makes my pelvic marrow ache." They pushed on, down a final sheer drop into a cavern so vast the far walls were lost. At its center, half buried in fallen stone and calcite, lay a skeleton of impossible scale. A humanoid giant, its ribcage arching overhead like a cathedral's beams, its skull a collapsed ruin of shattered horns. But it was the pelvis that drew the eye, massive, the iliac crests flared like a bull's horns, and the bone itself gleamed with a deep, ruddy luster, as though fire still slept in its mineral matrix. Ancient talismans, yellowed with age but still crackling with residual power, were plastered across the bone in overlapping seals. Yeren approached cautiously, reading the inscriptions. These are binding seals. They trapped something inside the bone. A spirit, maybe, or a memory too dangerous to let roam. Jin Wuying ignored her. The pull was a physical thing, a tide dragging him forward. His skullfire guttered and flared. The bony plates along his spine rattled. He reached out a skeletal hand. Master, wait, the seals. His phalanges brushed the pelvic surface. The talismans ignited, blazing with holy golden fire, but the flames passed through his bones harmlessly. Something older answered from within the bone. A presence, titanic and indifferent, older than the martial world, older than the first sect. Then the necro-key osseous assimilation triggered, and the world broke apart. Power flooded him. Not just martial arts, though along with it came the thunderous, terrain-shattering knowledge of the mountain-quaking kick, a technique that channeled earth-vein chi through the legs and hips to split the very ground. No, this was a deluge of raw death essence, so dense and potent that his bone frame began to crack. Hairline fractures raced up his femurs. His skullfire roared into a vortex. Agony, white and absolute, seared through every fiber of his being, and he understood then what the talismans had bound, not a spirit, but the Titan's dying scream, a reservoir of unspent vengeance. He fell to his knees, the impact jarring loose chips of bone. Yeren rushed to his side, but he raised a trembling hand. Don't touch. His voice was a grating whisper. I have to digest it. Guard me. 4 hours, maybe. He sank inward, turning all his will to the task. His marrow chi, already stretched thin, was consumed greedily to fuse the new essence into his structure. The cracks began to seal, but slowly, slowly. He saw now the design the Titan's legacy demanded. His leg bones weren't merely mending, they were reorganizing. Tendrils of condensed death energy wove into the marrow cavities, forming tough, sinewy cords, death knot tendons, far stronger than before. His pelvis, the very bone he'd touched, became a locus of stability, its structure densifying, integrating with his lower spine to form a gyroscopic core. When he moved again, the ground itself would answer the thunder in his hips. But the process left him utterly vulnerable. His skullfire dimmed to an ember, and his limbs refused to obey him. He could only kneel, bowed over the giant pelvis, while the assimilation ran its course. The chasm wraiths came as Yeren had feared. They materialized from the walls like exhaled smoke, spectral figures, their faces blurred, their hands elongated into claws of frozen light. They keened a sound that was half lament, half hunger, and converged on the immobilized skeleton. Yeren did not hesitate. She snatched up the 3 bone spears Jin Wuying had hardened with his own chi before their descent. The shafts. The silence in the gravid maw's depths was a heavy blanket, broken only by the occasional drip of mineral-laden water and the distant chitter of things that feared the light. Jin Wuying stood motionless in a side cavern, his newly forged frame still humming with the Titan's ancient power. The pelvic plate that now served as his core hub was a solid anchor of ossified death chi, and the death knot tendon. It took a lurching step, then another, its movements clumsy but undeniably obedient. Yeren drew a sharp breath. You're controlling them. A death knot tendril technique, he said, the name forming from the marrow knowledge the Titan had imparted. Each puppet is bound to my core. I can link many, but each thread draws on my reservoir. He released the tendrils, and the skeleton collapsed into a heap. The brief experiment had cost a noticeable fraction of his chi. Raising a true army would require far more power, or a strategic harvest. We returned to the valley floor. There are bones enough there to build a force. They ascended through the chasm's winding passages. The gravity fluctuations grew weaker as they climbed, and the necrotic gas patches Yeren had neutralized with crushed silverleaf no longer fouled the air. When they emerged into the bone-littered valley twilight, Jin Wuying's skullfire burned brighter, sensing the residual death essence in every fragment. He moved methodically. The first skeleton he selected was that of a Murim foot soldier, its bones still clad in rusted armor plates. He knelt, pressing his hand to the skull. The assimilation flooded him with a cascade of chi memories, sword forms, shield bashes, the dull rhythm of marching drills. They were mediocre arts, but the raw material was what he needed. The skeleton rose on command, its eye sockets flaring with a dull green light. He repeated the process with archers, spearmen, even a pair of beastmongers whose remains held the echoes of tamed valley reptiles. Each addition thrummed through the web of death knot tendrils, a constant, humming drain on his marrow chi. Yeren followed at a distance, her herbal scent a stark contrast to the grave stench. Occasionally she would point out a buried skeleton, her knowledge of the valley's geography guiding him to hidden skirmish sites. After an hour, a score of bone puppets stood in ragged ranks behind him. He assessed them with a tactician's eye. They were expendable, slow, and incapable of complex techniques. Visions exploded, moonless nights, silent infiltrations, the taste of poison on a blade, and above all, a movement art that melded the user into shadows, muffling all sound and smearing their afterimage. The shadow step. He absorbed it from every member of the unit, the technique refining with each connection until it etched itself into his leg bones, weaving through the death knot tendons with a shadowy tint. When he rose, his own form flickered, the dark green aura dimming until he seemed a wraith rather than a skeleton. The bone puppets he controlled shivered, and the tendrils connecting them darkened, becoming nearly invisible. He commanded them to reform, and they moved without a single clatter of bone. A whole special forces unit's arts, Yeren whispered. You took them all. I took their legacy, Jin Wuying replied. Now, watch. He spread his arms, and the score of bone warriors arranged themselves into a wedge formation he had once called the venomous dragon net, a tactic designed to isolate and crush enemy champions. But instead of rigid discipline, he twisted the formation, ordering the warriors to break apart and recombine in unpredictable, flowing patterns that exploited their undead resilience. A mock battle unfurled on the valley floor, his puppets clashing against each other with swords and spears, their movements silent, their strikes precise. They phased momentarily through shadows, appearing behind one another, a dance of silent death. Yeren hugged her arms. It's beautiful in a terrible way. But those were your comrades' techniques once. They are my tools now, Jin Wuying said, the skullfire in his eye sockets unwavering. The Alliance leader died in betrayal. What rises from his bones owes no loyalty to the past. Now, look to the peak. They turned toward the altar of screaming skies. High above the valley's rim, a sickly golden light pulsed like a second sun, casting long, wavering shadows. Even from this distance, Jin Wuying felt the light as an invasive pressure. The bone warriors in his tendril web twitched, their movements growing sluggish, the death chi binding them fraying at the edges. A sunstone, Yeren said, her voice tight. The Murim subjugation army brought a refined sunstone to the forward camp. Its radiance weakens any undead. If you try to march your army up there, they'll collapse before they can strike a single blow. Jin Wuying studied the glow. The master array around the camp was a lattice of blue and gold threads visible only to his death-attuned senses. Yet the shadow step allowed brief phasing through solid objects and wards that were not specifically keyed against shadow arts. And a sunstone, properly inverted, could be turned from a bane into a terrifying amplifier. If I steal it, he said slowly, I can retune its resonance with my own death chi. The light that weakens my soldiers will burn the Alliance's living disciples. You can't take the whole army with you, Yeren protested. The ward network is a master array, it would screech the moment any significant undead force enters. And the sunstone itself is guarded by at least 3 peak masters. Then the army stays here. Jin Wuying's tendrils retracted, and the wind carried no sound, and yet the shadows moved. Jin Wuying flowed between tent and palisade like ink spilled on parchment, his skeletal form dissolving into every pool of darkness the camp's torches could not reach. The shadow step was a revelation, each stride bent the space between light and absence, letting him glide through the patrols undetected. But the sunstone burned like a miniature star at the camp's heart, and its piercing rays forced him to dart behind crates and supply wagons, his bones aching with each exposure. Already he felt the drain, a slow siphoning of the death chi coiled in his marrow, the same wispy blue-black tendrils that now laced his joints and knotted his ribs. He had perhaps 2 hours before the sunstone's constant pressure extinguished his skullfire completely. He had left Yeren 3 leagues east with the bone army, hidden in a ravine beneath a canopy of petrified trees. If he did not return before dawn, she would retreat deeper into the bone-grave valley and scatter the puppets. The thought of her waiting, clutching that jade talisman he had carved for her, stiffened his resolve. He could not afford failure. The camp was a sprawl of hastily erected fortifications, but the Alliance had not forgotten its discipline. Guards in silvery blue robes patrolled in pairs, their swords unsheathed, their eyes scanning the darkness with the vigilance of men who feared what lurked in the valley. They had reason to fear, reports of a bone ghost wielding lost techniques had reached them. But they could not imagine that the ghost was their former supreme leader, nor that he now crept among them as a silent wraith. Jin Wuying pressed his spine against a stack of saltpeter barrels, the sunstone's light blazing across the central clearing. In its glow, he saw the array, concentric rings of talisman scrolls pinned to wooden stakes, their paper rustling with charged chi. At the center, on a raised stone platform, the sunstone fragment hovered within a cage of silver filigree, its light a constant, humming anathema to the undead. And supervising it, her back to him, was a woman he knew. Captain Suyin. She had been barely more than a girl when he accepted her into the Alliance's inner training corps. He remembered her fierce dedication, the countless nights she had practiced the orthodox sword forms until her hands bled. He had praised her precision, promoted her. Now she stood there, her uniform crisp, her hand resting on the hilt of a blade he himself had awarded her, scanning the perimeter with the same sharp eyes he had once found so promising. A heavy, unnameable emotion briefly overwhelmed the cold logic of his skeletal consciousness. He could not strike her, not because she could harm him, but because some residue of Jin Wuying the man refused to raise a hand against a student he had nurtured. So he would not strike. He would unweave the trap around her. The Heaven's Six-Wrist Dance, an art he had absorbed from the bones of a long-dead grandmaster of the elusive spider sect, was not a combat technique in the orthodox sense. It was a method of simultaneous, independent movement for each limb, designed to manipulate multiple objects at once. In life, its practitioners could disarm a dozen opponents or juggle vials of poison without spilling a drop. In death, his phantom bone fingers, crackling with faint death chi, could perform feats of dexterity no living hand could match. He sank deeper into the shadows and extended his will. From beneath the earth, the death knot tendrils he had woven into his frame uncoiled like underground roots, slithering through the soil until they brushed the outermost ring of talismans. Then, with a surgeon's precision, his six-wrist motion began. Fingers of bone tendrils flicked and twisted, peeling back the talismanic papers without tearing them, loosening the knots that bound the protective array. One by one, the talismans drifted to the ground, their chi connections severed silently. The absorption was instantaneous, a perfect copy, the neural pathways of ghostly muscle memory etching themselves into Jin Wuying's bone marrow. Now he understood the Sunstone's cage. It was a modified Heaven's Light seal, radiating anti-undead yang chi. But Wu Miao's art revealed the flaw, the resonance points where yang could be forced into yin, where the purifying light could become a suppressing weight on the living instead. He rose, no longer hiding from the Sunstone's glare. Captain Suyin spotted him then, a skeleton clad in a patched cloak of shadow, skullfire burning in empty sockets, a faint blue-black web of tendrils pulsing across his ribs. She gasped, her blade half-drawn. "It's him. Sound the..." Too late. Jin Wuying slammed both palms against the silver filigree cage, and the heavenly seal reversal ignited through his bones. The Sunstone's light stuttered, flared white, then inverted into a murky amber pulse that rippled outward like a tide of lead. Every living warrior within 20 meters felt their cultivated chi seize, legs buckled, swords fell from numb fingers. Captain Suyin dropped to one knee, her face contorted in shock, her own chi suppressed as if crushed by an invisible mountain. Jin Wuying did not waste the moment. The death knot tendrils exploded from his spine, lancing into the soil in all directions. From beneath the camp, scores of buried bones, remnants of past battles, forgotten victims of the valley, shuddered to macabre life. They erupted through the ground in a rain of clattering, grasping claws, skeletal arms, legless torsos, tooth-filled skulls that lunged at the paralyzed soldiers. Not true warriors, but distractions. The camp dissolved into chaos. Shouts, screams, the clang of dropped armor. He reached into the now darkened cage and plucked the sunstone fragment, a rough-hewn gem the size of a heart, from its now useless mounts. The inverted energy still cursed the air, but as he pressed the fragment against his ribcage, his death knot tendons writhed eagerly, wrapping around it like serpents. They had been tempered by the Titan's essence, they could neutralize the anti-undead property at its source. The cold yang shone through his bones, but the tendrils filtered it, sinking it with his own death chi until the fragment glowed with a paradox, a warm, sun-colored aura that did not burn him but instead wove itself into his frame as a protective mantle. His skeleton now shimmered faintly, the ivory bones stained with threads of golden light, a living contradiction, undead yet crowned with the light of day. He gave Suyin one last look. She was struggling to rise, her eyes wide with disbelief and something akin to recognition. He had no voice to speak, but he inclined his skull, just slightly, a gesture she would not understand, a farewell to a bond long severed. Then he melded back into the shadows and was gone, the inverted sunstone's energy still pounding through the camp like a funeral bell. The panicked shouts faded as he raced through the darkness, the flame in his chest burning steadier than ever. He had dawn. The heat struck like a hammer blow the moment Jin Wuying stepped past the jagged entrance of the canyon. Sulphurous fumes coiled in the air, and the rocky walls glowed with a sullen orange light that pulsed like the heartbeat of some buried titan. Yeren stumbled behind him, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the hem of her robe already singed from the superheated stone underfoot. The skeleton turned his skull to regard her, the twin flames of his eye sockets flickering with an unspoken question. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her fingers trembled around the medicine pouch at her waist. "Just, keep going. The blacksmith's tomb should be ahead, in the deepest vent." Jin Wuying gave a single nod, the motion causing the sunstone shard embedded in his ribcage to pulse with a muted golden light. The anti-undead energy had been inverted, now a gentle warmth that bolstered his death chi rather than scouring it. Still, the weight of the shard was a constant reminder that his existence was an anomaly, a skeleton who defied the very laws of orthodox cultivation. He turned and advanced, his bone feet clacking on the volcanic glass. The tunnel narrowed into a throat of obsidian and then spat them into a vast cavern. The ceiling vanished into gloom, but the floor was a cracked expanse of cooling lava dotted with vents that belched toxic steam. At the far end, seated upon a throne of fused iron ingots, was the skeleton of the heaven-forging blacksmith. The legendary smith had died in his forge, that much was clear. The entire cavern was a workshop, ancient anvils stood half-melted, quenching troughs still brimmed with black, oily water, and the walls were lined with the rusted husks of tools no living smith could lift. But what seized Jin Wuying's attention was the skeleton's left arm. It was not bone. From the shoulder down, the arm was a prosthetic of star metal, dark iron threaded with veins of silver that glimmered in the firelight. The metal fingers were curled around a hammer that had fused to the palm after centuries of disuse. He built himself an arm that could withstand the forge's heart, Yeren breathed, her voice thick with awe. They say he cracked a meteorite open with his bare hands and drew the iron from its core while it still burned. Jin Wuying approached, his own skeletal frame seeming pathetically fragile next to the smith's remains. The urge to touch, to assimilate, was a gnawing hunger in the marrow of his phalanges. But he hesitated. The blacksmith had not been a martial artist in the traditional sense, his power lay in creation, not combat. Would the necro-ki osseous assimilation even work? The cheat demanded perfected martial arts, instincts, and chi memories. Was the art of forging considered a martial art? He reached out, the bone of his index finger brushing the star metal knuckles. Agony, white-hot and absolute, slammed through his consciousness. It was not the pain of physical assimilation but the sheer weight of a life lived at the anvil. Memories flooded him, the first time the blacksmith's hammer struck glowing ingot, the spray of sparks that tattooed his skin, the thousand hours of shaping metal until the smith's own soul seemed to temper with the steel. The skeleton in front of him shuddered, and Jin Wuying felt the divine forging technique sear itself into his chi core. Then the star metal arm detached from the dead smith with a screech of tearing metal. The prosthetic flew through the air and clamped onto Jin Wuying's left humerus, the star metal plates snapping around his bone like a closing trap. He staggered, nearly toppling into a lava vent. The arm was impossibly heavy, a dead weight that threatened to unbalance his entire skeletal frame. It dragged at his shoulder socket, and the death chi in his core drained alarmingly just to keep the fingers from dragging on the stone. "Master!" Yeren rushed forward, but he raised his right hand, still bone, to stop her. The arm was grafted. He could feel the star metal as if it were his own flesh, every rivet and seam resonating with the remnant chi of its creator. The divine forging technique unfolded in his mind, a blueprint of how to shape weapons from bone and metal, how to channel martial arts into a blade until it breathed on its own. But the cost was staggering. The arm needed a constant flood of death chi to function, without it, Jin Wuying would be anchored, a brittle skeleton pinned by a limb of fallen star. His skullfire chi core guttered dangerously low. Only the sunstone's steady glow kept the flames from extinguishing entirely. He scanned the cavern, his enhanced senses picking through the volcanic fumes. There, in the vents, half buried in cooling magma, were the skeletal remains of the beasts that had once been the blacksmith's fuel. "I must absorb them," he rasped, his voice a clatter of bone vibrations that Yeren had learned to interpret. "Their bones hold death energy. Stay here." He lurched toward the nearest vent, the star arm gouging a furrow in the stone. Yeren watched with wide, frightened eyes but obeyed, kneeling beside the dead smith's remains. The first beast skeleton was a serpentine thing with ribs like curved swords. Jin Wuying plunged his right hand into the ribcage. Assimilation. The creature's meager chi, pure, predatory, and long silent, poured into him. The skull fire flared brighter, and the star arm's weight lessened by a fraction. He moved to the next, a hulking quadruped with a skull like a hammer. Assimilation. Then a cluster of winged reptiles fused into the rock. Assimilation. Each absorption sent a jolt of raw death chi into his core, and with each surge, the star arm lifted a little higher, the fingers flexing with greater fluidity. By the time he'd drained a dozen vents, his left arm hung at his side with the natural menace of a weapon. The star metal plates had melded more seamlessly with his humerus, and dark tendon-like strands of death chi snaked from the joint, binding the prosthetic into his very being. The divine forging technique was fully integrated now, and he could feel the knowledge crystallizing: how to infuse a bone shard with the essence of a martial art, how to forge a living weapon that would execute techniques on its own. Yeren approached tentatively, her eyes fixed on the transformed arm. "You did it. It's beautiful, in a terrifying way." Jin Wuying did not answer. Instead, he turned to the largest vent, where a titanic centipede skeleton coiled around a magma tube. Its fangs were two curved blades of obsidian hard chitin, each as long as a short sword. With the star arm, he reached down and wrenched one free. The limb screamed with metal-on-metal protest, but the fang came away in his grip, already humming with residual death chi. He laid the fang on the nearest anvil. The star arm's fingers moved with a will of their own, shaping, tempering, infusing. Jin Wuying poured the blue cloud sword art into the weapon, the elegant slashes, the chi spirals, the perfect footwork, all compressed into the molecular memory of the bone. The fang began to glow with a pale blue light, and intricate sword pattern etchings snaked along its length. When he lifted it, the blade hummed a sharp, eager note. "This is a bone weapon," he said, and extended it to Yeren. "Take it. It knows the blue cloud sword art as intimately as I do. When you hold it, the sword will guide your limbs." She hesitated only a moment before wrapping her fingers around the hilt. The instant her palm closed, the blade flared with azure light, and Yeren gasped as the techniques flooded her muscle memory. She took a shaky step back and, almost unwillingly, executed a flawless opening stance of the blue cloud sword art. I can feel it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "It wants to fight." Jin Wuying felt a flicker of approval in his deathless chest. With Yeren now a combatant, his chances of surviving the coming storm had increased. But even as he thought this, the cavern walls shuddered. The sound was unmistakable, the rhythmic stomp of armored boots, the clink of talismans, and the low chanting of an orthodox formation array. Kang's forces had breached the canyon of iron ashes. And they had brought the mummified arm of the heaven-forging blacksmith's twin, the tracking seal had led them straight to the forge. Yeren tensed, the bone sword rising even before she could think. "Master, they're here." The far wall of the cavern exploded inward in a shower of molten rock. Silhouetted against the fiery glow stood Supreme Leader Kong, his pristine white robes billowing despite the heat. In one hand, he held a mirror of polished obsidian, its surface reflecting not light but a deep, hungry darkness. Behind him, 2 rows of elite guards leveled enchanted spears, their tips gleaming with anti-undead talismans. Kang's smile was a blade drawn slow. "So predictable, brother." The blacksmiths. The volcanic tunnel shook as Jin Wuying pulled Yeren through a fissure just wide enough for his skeletal frame. Behind them, the clatter of armored boots and the hum of the soul extraction array echoed through the black basalt. He did not look back. His left arm, the star metal prosthetic fused with humming death knot tendons, dragged against the stone, sparking in the dark, but he forced it forward, each motion draining precious remnants of necrotic chi from his core. "Master, the ceiling." Yeren gasped. Without turning, Jin Wuying thrust his bone-white right hand upward. The centipede fang sword sheathed at her waist answered before thought. It unsheathed itself, a sliver of chitin and marrow, and shot into the tunnel roof. Blue cloud sword art erupted from its edge, a cascade of azure arcs that bit deep into the volcanic crust. Crack spiderwebbed, then a section of the ceiling collapsed in a rumble of dust and obsidian shards. The pursuing shouts muffled, cut off by tons of rock. The living sword spun and returned to Yeren's grasp, still trembling with residual sword intent. Jin Wuying's skull flared a faint phosphorus green. His voice scraped out, hollow, "That will not hold him long." Kong carries the extraction array. If he corners us before we reach the altar, our bones become his ingredients. They climbed. The lava tube steepened, its walls narrowing until Jin Wuying had to fold his ribcage inward, vertebrae popping, to squeeze through. The air grew thin, cold, laced with a high-pitched keening that vibrated through solid bone. The sound of screaming skies. Yeren pressed a cloth to her nose. The elders of the medicine sect wrote of this place. The altar of screaming skies, a test left by the war god's architects. Jin Wuying's crimson eye sockets flickered. He had studied such legends during his mortal reign as Murim Alliance Leader, sifting through forbidden texts. The cipher he sought was no mere riddle, it required a sacrifice. Tangible proof of martial accumulation. They emerged onto a plateau of fused black glass. Wind tore at them, not air but a shrieking pressure that carved spirals in the ash. At the plateau's center stood an obelisk of dark crystal, 30 feet high, its surface carved with 10,000 overlapping handprints. Each handprint seemed to move when not looked at directly, fingers curling into unfamiliar martial gestures. The sky above the obelisk churned a bruised purple, lightning streaking upward into the void as if the heavens themselves were bleeding. The keening was the sound of 1,000 battle cries trapped in stone. Jin Wuying approached. His bare footbones left no prints in the ash. As he neared, the obelisk's surface shimmered, and a mouth, vertical, lipless, fanged with crystal, split open down its middle. A voice not heard but felt in the marrow spoke, "Give what you have taken. 1,000 years of stolen fist and blade. Or be devoured where you stand." Yeren stumbled back, the living sword held before her. Jin Wuying stopped. He understood. The obelisk demanded martial essence, bones infused with perfected techniques, memories of dead masters. He had accumulated much, phantom bone fist from the valley beasts, heaven's six-wrist dance from a shattered rogue cultivator, blue cloud sword art from the sect ancestor's grave, and now the divine forging technique seared into the fabric of his star metal arm. That arm alone represented centuries of smithing mastery. But it was not enough. The altar hungered for more than raw technique, it wanted material proof. Sacrifice of the physical. "Master, your arm, it's flickering," Yeren said. Jin Wuying looked down. And he possessed something else, something Yeren had pocketed in the chaos of the forge's destruction. "The fragment," he rasped. "The sunstone you took from the lava vents." Yeren's eyes widened. She pulled from her tunic a lump of crystallized solar essence, no larger than a child's fist, still warm from its molten nest. It pulsed like a heartbeat. She had grabbed it on instinct as they fled, the way a herbalist gathers rare ingredients. "Will this help?" "It is condensed geomantic energy. A piece of a star. With my arm's star metal, it may match the requirement." He did not hesitate. He stepped to the obelisk's maw and thrust his left arm inside. The crystal teeth clamped down. Agony, not of flesh, for he had none, but of memory, of technique being ripped from his very identity. The divine forging technique screamed through his skull as the arm disassembled, plate by plate, each fragment of star metal dissolving into motes of light sucked into the altar. The death knots writhed and snapped free, retreating into his shoulder socket, leaving bare bone beneath. His core dimmed. The violet marrow fire guttered. But he remained upright. He took the sunstone from Yeren and dropped it into the maw. The obelisk absorbed it in a blinding flash. The screaming sky went silent. Then, from the 10,000 handprints, a single, immense palm thrust outward, translucent, armored in spectral bronze, and slammed into Jin Wuying's chest. He expected destruction. Instead, his consciousness erupted. A cipher unwound in his mind, coordinates, burial rites, the true location of the ancient war god's tomb. A crown of ghostly light fitted itself over his skull, then shattered outward into a full-body aura, the war god's echo. Jin Wuying's skeletal frame bloomed with phantoms. 1,000 martial forms flared into existence around him, each one a perfect execution of a technique he had absorbed. Phantom bone fist lashed out in 12 directions. Heaven's six-wrist dance wove impossible angles. Blue cloud sword art traced azure mantras in the air. And more, techniques he had not yet named, stolen from beast and man, all burning at once, magnified tenfold in potency. His bones sang with borrowed power. But the price was stitched into the gift. He felt, deep in his marrow, the inevitable aftermath. The echo would last one day. When it faded, his entire skeletal structure would fracture, perhaps irreparably. He would be reduced to shards. He had one day. Master, you're shining, Yaren whispered. He turned his skull toward her, the eye sockets now blazing not red but ancient gold. The war god's echo. Temporary. Do not fear what you see next. From the tunnel below, rock exploded outward. Supreme Leader Kong emerged, his black and gold robe singed, his mirror-shaped artifact gleaming on his back. Behind him poured the elite of the Alliance Extermination Army, swordsmen, archers, chi manipulators, their faces pale and grim. They encircled the plateau, cutting off retreat. Kang's lips split in a triumphant smile. You have led us to the altar yourself, Wu Ying. The cipher is now mine for the taking. The soul extraction array will tear the assimilation cheat from your marrow and gift it to the Alliance. Jin Wu Ying's voice cut through the wind, amplified by the echo into a chorus of dead masters. You forget, Kong. I was your Alliance leader. I trained half of you. Those martial bones you carry in your camp's reliquary. I know every technique they held. I have already devoured their ancestors' secrets. Now, with the echo, I am every master you have ever buried. The phantoms around him solidified. 100 martial stances locked onto the army. He raised his bare right hand, and the sky screamed anew. But I will not waste this power on your foot soldiers. You want the assimilation cheat? Face me alone. Single combat. Leader to false leader. If I fall, tear my bones apart and take what you wish. If you fall, the army disperses and the tomb is mine. Kang's expression flickered. The challenge was public. To refuse in front of his assembled forces would brand him a coward, unraveling his authority. But to accept meant facing the full force of the war god's echo. The crystal obelisk watched, its mouth silent now, its handprint surface recording every strike to come. Kong took one step forward. The mirror on his back flared to life, drinking in the ambient death chi. I accept. Let the Alliance see who truly deserves to lead, the man, or the bone. The wind shrieked. The phantom martial forms around Jin Wuying screamed in 100 fighting cries, and the sky above. The air above the volcanic caldera split with the shriek of a soul extraction array activating. Runes of sickly green light spiderwebbed across the black stone, and the assembled Murim army roared, 300 elite cultivators from 7 orthodox sects, their chi auras a storm of righteous fury. Supreme Leader Kong stood at their head, his once familiar face twisted with a mask of pious hatred, the same face that had poured poisoned wine and smiled as Jin Wuying's body convulsed. But now Jin Wuying faced him not as a dying man, but as a skeleton wreathed in ghostly luminance. The war god's echo pulsed through his every bone, a celestial resonance that turned his marrow into a battlefield symphony. Phantom martial forms flickered around him, the stances of masters long dead, their perfected arts bleeding into his frame. Each step he took toward the flat killing ground sent cracks through the volcanic glass. Traitor, Jin Wuying's voice resonated from the skull fire, no longer a whisper of bone but a clarion of death. You demand a demon's head. Here I stand. Face me alone, or admit before your army that you never had the courage to kill me honorably. Kang's lips pressed thin. Behind him, the army murmured. An orthodox leader could not refuse single combat without losing face. He drew his sword, a blade of frosted steel known as Moon Fang, and the soul extraction arrays hummed with treacherous readiness. You are a corpse clinging to stolen power. I will cut you down and purify the Murim. They clashed. Kong attacked first, his Moon Fang carving arcs of silver chi that froze the moisture in the air to diamond dust. It was the Heaven's Ice Severance, a high-tier orthodox technique meant to shatter undead bones with absolute cold. Jin Wuying saw the move not with eyes but with the battle instincts of a dozen absorbed masters. His skeletal body flowed sideways, shadow step, a forgotten footwork stolen from the grave of an assassin, leaving the ice slash to shatter a boulder. Before Kong could reset, Jin Wuying's right arm lashed out, the phantom bone fist uncoiling like a whip of death. His finger bones elongated momentarily, striking at Kang's wrist with impossible precision. Kong twisted away, but not before a chip of steel flew from his vambrace. You've grown slow, brother. Kong snarled and signaled with his free hand. The soul extraction arrays beneath their feet flashed, and ethereal chains erupted from the ground, seeking to bind Jin Wuying's soul fire. But Jin Wuying had been watching. The echo granted him not just power but the collective tactical wisdom of every warrior he had assimilated. He stomped one bony foot, the mountain-quaking kick, an art taken from the leg bone of a fallen giant ape beast far below the valley. The entire stone platform bucked, throwing off the array's targeting. Chains grabbed only afterimages. He pressed forward, closing the distance. The Heaven's six-wrist dance wove his arms into a blur of simultaneous strikes, 6 trajectories of bone striking at Kang's throat, temple, heart, groin, thigh, and sword hand. Kang's orthodox defense, the immovable stone wall art, barely held. But Jin Wuying had studied that too. It had belonged to Kang's own master, whose skeleton now rested in his spatial marrow ring. He altered the rhythm, inserting a half-beat pause that broke the flow of Kang's counter-chi, and his fingerknife sliced a gash across Kang's cheek. Blood, hot and red, splattered the ground. The army saw it. The murmuring grew. Filthy bone ghost. Kang abandoned pretense. He threw a silk pouch that burst into a cloud of soul-devouring powder, a substance that dissolved spiritual constructs. Jin Wuying exhaled a concentrated burst of death energy from his ribcage, dispersing it, but the distraction served its purpose. Kang lunged with a technique Jin Wuying knew intimately, the blue cloud sword art's highest killing form, celestial cloud severance. The same art he had absorbed from the centipede Fang sword, the perfected version of blue cloud's founder. In Kang's hands, it was flawed. His left foot angled too wide, his wrist tension choked the final acceleration. Jin Wuying almost smiled, though his skull lacked flesh. He let the strike come, then pivoted with shadow step, not backward, but forward into the arc of death. A normal fighter would be bisected. Instead, his ribcage folded like a serpent's, a gift of the serpent bone flexibility he'd taken from a dead demonic cultivator. The blade passed through empty space between his third and fourth ribs. Simultaneously, his left hand clamped onto Kang's sword arm, and his right hand pressed flat against the chest of the nearest raised skeleton, a warrior from the fallen Alliance vanguard, one of many he had animated during the retreat through the tunnels. The moment his phalanges touched that nameless soldier's sternum, a flood of memory crashed into him. Not martial arts, but emotions, the soldier's final loyalty to the Alliance leader who had been betrayed, his hatred for the new regime that had sent him to die. Jin Wuying channeled that raw, concentrated grievance through the echo and into a single, focused pulse. The soul extraction mirror that Kang was even now raising from his robes, a palm-sized obsidian glass meant to trap Jin Wuying's consciousness, screamed and shattered. Kang froze. The mirror's backlash projected its dying vision outward, a tapestry of faces, the comrades he had poisoned, the subordinates he had sacrificed, their eyes full of the agony of betrayal. Every soldier in the army saw it. Kang's own squad leaders saw their former friends' death masks. No, this is a trick, Kang's voice cracked. Jin Wuying released his arm and stepped back. His right hand, still crackling with the amplified war god essence, formed a bone spear from his own forearm, a dense, obsidian lance of condensed death chi infused with the structural memory of the gold-shattering spear art. He had found that art etched into the pelvis of a tomb guardian. You used the blue cloud sword art to cut down my followers. But you never mastered its flaw. He thrust. The spear tip traced the exact minute gap in the celestial cloud severance's overhead guard, the flaw he had recognized because the original creator had died perfecting it. The black bone entered Kang's chest just left of the sternum, sliding between ribs and piercing the heart with a sound like tearing silk. Kang's body arched. Moon Fang clattered to the stone. His eyes, wide with disbelief, met Jin Wuying's empty sockets. You were supposed to die. I did. Jin Wuying twisted the spear, and Kang's life force guttered out. The body crumpled. Before it hit the ground, the skeleton within began to rattle. Jin Wuying's bone touch activated automatically, and Kang's entire martial legacy poured into him, the ice severance, the stone wall art, the true depths of the conspiracy, the names of every conspirator, the location of their secret treasuries. But more potent than any technique was the memory of the betrayal, Kang's own gloating recollection of the poison, the fall, the night he took everything. Jin Wuying stood over the body, absorbing it. His skeletal form rippled. New plates of frost-hardened bone layered over his shoulders. The death knot tendons thickened, and his skullfire shifted from blue-white to a deep, imperial violet. The army watched in stunned silence. The traitor is dead. Jin Wuying's voice echoed now with a weight that pressed on their souls. You have seen his shame. I am the true Alliance leader, not of the living, but of the fallen. I will not slaughter you. You were deceived. His bony hand swept outward. The bone general authority, forged in the altar's furnace, resonated. Fallen soldiers from the army's recent battles, the dead they had left unburied in the valley, stirred. Skeletons rose from the cracks in the volcanic floor, forming a silent corridor. Go back. Tell the sects that the bone demon does not seek the Murim's destruction. I will rebuild it, from the shadows, as its death emperor. Weapons wavered. A young blue cloud disciple dropped his sword first. Then another. The army broke, retreating in a tide of haunted faces. Yeren, who had watched from the altar's edge with a marrow pill clutched in her shaking fingers, rushed forward as the last soldier vanished into the smoke. The war god's echo guttered. Jin Wuying's body convulsed. Cracks raced across every bone, from skull to metatarsals, as the celestial power departed. He toppled, and Yeren caught him, pressing the pill, a concoction of spirit turtle marrow and Death Valley nightshade, into his mandible. The cracks sealed slowly, but not completely. He was fragile now, a web of fractures held together by will. "You mad skeleton," she whispered, tears cutting tracks through the ash on her cheeks. "You challenged an army for a dramatic speech. Worth it." His voice was a mere click of bone. "Help.